The candles in the Whitmore ballroom had not yet burned low when Celestine Ardell watched her entire future collapse, not with a scream, not with tears, but with a single glance across a crowded dance floor. There was her fiancé, Matthias Vaughn, her Matthias, standing beneath a cascade of white roses, his hand pressed tenderly against the cheek of her younger sister, Isolde, and Isolde was not pulling away. Celestine did not move, she did not breathe. She simply stood there in her pale gold gown, holding a glass of champagne that had long since gone warm, watching the man she had spent 3 years loving choose someone who shared her blood. She always was the prettier one, she heard a woman whisper nearby. Such a shame about the elder Miss Ardell, said another. But before the humiliation could swallow her whole, before she could turn and disappear into the shadows where broken women go, a voice cut through, the music like a blade through silk, low, deliberate, entirely too close to her ear. Don't give them the satisfaction of watching you crumble, Miss Ardell. She turned, and standing beside her, tall and immovable as a cathedral in winter, was Caspian Aldridge, the Duke of Norfield, a man who never spoke to anyone at these gatherings, a man whose dark eyes had seen war, scandal, and ruin, and remained utterly unmoved by all of it. Until now he was looking at her, only at her, with an expression she could not name, not pity, not amusement, something far more dangerous than either. Your sister has taken what was yours, he said quietly, lifting his own glass as though they were simply discussing the weather. So perhaps it is time you took something of hers. Celestine stared at him. I beg your pardon. The Duke turned to face her fully then, and the candlelight caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the ghost of something unspoken behind his gaze. Marry me instead. The champagne glass slipped from Celestine's fingers. But why is the Duke of Norfield, a man who swore he would never marry, standing in this ballroom making an offer to a woman he has barely spoken 10 words to? What is he hiding, and what will Celestine say? Knowing her heart is still bleeding, but her pride refuses to break, you already know this story is going to be everything. If you want to find out what Celestine says next, and why this Duke is far more dangerous than he appears, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because this is only the beginning, and beloved, it gets so much better. The glass did not shatter when it hit the floor. It simply cracked down the middle, clean and quiet, the way certain things break when they have been under pressure for far too long. Much like Celestine herself. She stared at Caspian Aldridge, Duke of Norfield, and for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath with her. The music continued. Couples continued to waltz. Somewhere behind her, she could still feel the warmth of Matthias and Isolde's little moment burning into her back, like an ember that refused to go out. But standing here in front of this man, with his impossible offer hanging in the air between them like smoke, Celestine felt something shift inside her chest, not healing. Not yet. Something closer to the decision a person makes, right before they step off a ledge. She looked away from him first. That was the thing about Celestine Ardell that most people in this ballroom had never bothered to understand. She was not weak. She had simply spent years making herself smaller so that others could feel larger. It had started the way most quiet sacrifices do, so gradually she hadn't noticed until it was already her entire life. She was the elder daughter of Reginald Ardell, a man of moderate fortune and enormous pride, whose greatest achievement in his own estimation was producing 2 daughters and managing not to go entirely bankrupt before either of them married. Her mother, Vivienne, was the kind of beautiful that aged like fine architecture, and who had long ago decided that Celestine's purpose in this family was to be sensible, reliable, the one who did not need to be worried about. And so Celestine had been sensible. Relentlessly, exhaustingly sensible. She had been sensible when Isolde forgot obligations and Celestine quietly covered for her. Sensible when her father's business dealings grew uncertain and she said nothing, only smiled and assured everyone that things would work out. Sensible when Matthias Vane had come courting 3 years ago, charming and golden-haired and full of exactly the right words, and she had allowed herself just once to believe that something good had chosen her on purpose. She had been a fool, but a sensible one. Isolde was 20 and luminous and laughed at everything, and never once seemed to carry the weight of a single consequence. Men looked at her the way they looked at open windows on warm days, with longing and the desire to lean into her completely. Celestine had told herself for years that she did not envy her sister. She had almost believed it, almost. She turned back to the Duke now, who had not moved, had not looked away, and was watching her with that same unreadable patience that she had heard spoken out in drawing rooms and parlours across the county. They said Caspian Alderidge had come back from the war in the north different. They said he had buried 2 close friends in a single winter and returned to his estate a man who smiled less and saw more. They said he was looking for something, though no one could agree on what. She had never paid those rumours much attention before tonight. "You cannot be serious," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I rarely say things I do not mean," he replied. "You may ask anyone here. They will confirm it is one of my least charming qualities." There was no smile on his face, but there was something at the corner of his mouth, not mockery. Something older than that. Celestine glanced once more across the ballroom. Matthias was laughing now at something Isolde had said, his head tilted toward her in the way it used to tilt toward Celestine, and the sight of it did something quiet and devastating to the space behind her ribs. She looked back at the Duke. She did not know what he wanted. She did not know why tonight. Why her? Why any of this? But she knew one thing with sudden and startling clarity. Whatever Caspian Alderidge was offering, it was not nothing. And Celestine Ardell had spent enough of her life accepting nothing dressed up as enough. "Tell me," she said slowly, "what exactly would this arrangement look like?" The Duke's gaze did not waver, but something behind it did, just barely, just for a moment, like a door that had been closed a very long time, swinging slightly open in a draught. "That," he said quietly, "is a conversation best had somewhere that is not here." And somehow, without fully understanding why, Celestine found herself nodding. He led her to the east corridor, away from the music and the candlelight and the careful eyes of everyone who had just watched her humiliation unfold in real time. The hallway was narrow and cool, lined with portraits of people who had been dead long enough that their expressions had stopped meaning anything, and Celestine followed the Duke of Norfield through it, with her hands clasped in front of her and her pulse doing something, entirely undignified behind her collarbone. She was not afraid. That surprised her. She thought she ought to be, walking away from a crowded room with a man she barely knew, a man whose reputation was built more on silence than on anything he had ever actually said or done in public. But fear required a certain investment in one's own future, and 30 seconds ago she had watched her future waltz away in the arms of her younger sister. So he stopped near a window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the Whitmore gardens were dark and still, the hedgerows cut into shapes that looked vaguely ominous in the absence of proper light. He turned to face her and said nothing for a moment, as if he were deciding something, or perhaps finishing a decision he had already made, before he ever crossed the ballroom to stand beside her. "My situation is straightforward," he said at last. "I need a wife before the end of the season. Not for sentiment, for necessity." Celestine kept her expression composed. "What kind of necessity? The legal kind?" He clasped his hands behind his back. "My uncle, Percival Alderidge, has contested my hold on the Norfield estate. He argues that a man of my age without a wife or heir is unfit to manage a dukedom of this size and influence. The courts have given me until the close of the season to demonstrate otherwise." She studied him. "And you chose to resolve this by approaching a woman whose engagement just dissolved in front of half the county." I chose to approach a woman who is intelligent, composed under pressure, and who will not mistake a practical arrangement for something it is not. He paused. Most women, I might have asked, would have arrived at the altar already in love with the idea of me. That would have complicated things considerably. There was no vanity in how he said it. It was simply a fact he had arranged alongside other facts, the way a general arranges information before making a decision about terrain. Celestine found to her own mild irritation that she respected it. "You want someone who will not fall in love with you," she said. "I want someone who understands what this is." "And what is it?" He met her eyes. "A transaction. Mutually beneficial. You receive the protection of my name and title at a moment when yours is about to become the subject of considerable gossip. I receive the legal standing I need to hold what is mine. When the matter of the estate is settled, we discuss terms of a quiet and dignified separation. No one is injured. No one is deceived." The corridor felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Celestine turned slightly toward the window, not to look at the gardens, but to give herself somewhere to rest her eyes that was not his face, because his face was doing nothing to help her think clearly. He was not handsome in the easy, conventional way Matthias was handsome. He was something more unsettling than that. The kind of face that had been through something real, and showed it, not in softness, but in the kind of stillness that only came from having survived. She thought about her mother, who would spend the next 3 weeks crafting a narrative about Matthias and Isolde that positioned Celestine as gracious and unbothered. She thought about her father, who would be relieved, quietly and privately relieved, because Matthias' family finances had recently shown cracks that Reginald Ardell had been too proud to mention aloud. She thought about the whispers she had already heard tonight, and the ones that would follow her into every parlour and promenade, for the remainder of the season if she returned to that ballroom alone. And then beneath all of that, quieter and more dangerous than any of it, she thought about the way she had spent 3 years arranging herself around Matthias Vane's comfort and preferences and silences, and how not once in all that time had he ever looked at her the way Caspian Aldridge was looking at her right now, as though she was someone worth calculating, someone who required taking seriously. It was a terrible reason to agree to anything. She knew that. She agreed anyway. "I have conditions," she said, turning back to face him. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Something closer to the specific attention of a man who had expected a door to be locked and found it open. "Name them," he said. She opened her mouth to speak. And that was precisely when the door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Isolde stepped through it, flushed and lovely, and laughing at something over her shoulder, with Matthias' hand resting at the small of her back like he had always belonged there. They, all four, stopped. The silence was the kind that had texture to it, the kind you could press your hand against and feel pushing back. Isolde's smile flickered. Her eyes moved from Celestine to the Duke and back again, and something crossed her face that Celestine had never seen there before. Not guilt, not quite. Something more complicated than guilt, something that looked, in the dim corridor light, almost like alarm. Matthias said nothing. He had the particular stillness of a man who knows he has done something and has not yet decided how he feels about being caught adjacent to it. Caspian Aldridge did not look at either of them. He looked only at Celestine, and in a voice entirely unhurried, entirely calm, said, "You were saying?" And Celestine, standing in that narrow hallway between everything she had lost and something she did not yet have a name for, lifted her chin and said, "I was saying yes." The word left her mouth and immediately became something solid in the air, something she could not reach back and take. Yes. One syllable, the smallest possible unit of agreement, and yet standing there in that corridor, with Isolde's flickering eyes on her face, and Matthias gone, perfectly still in the doorway, it felt enormous. It felt like the first true thing she had said in years. Isolde recovered first, because Isolde always recovered first. She had that quality, a kind of social elasticity, the ability to reshape herself around any awkward moment until the moment bent to fit her instead. "Celestine," she said, and her voice was warm and careful in the way that beautiful people learn to make their voices when they want to appear innocent. "I was looking for you. Mama was asking." "Mama can wait," Celestine said. Isolde blinked. In 20 years of sisterhood, Celestine could not recall a single time she had said those 3 words in that particular order. Neither, apparently, could Isolde, because for just a moment the elasticity failed, and something raw moved across her face before she smoothed it away again. Matthias cleared his throat. "Celestine, I think perhaps we should speak privately." "You have said everything that needed saying," Celestine replied. Quite eloquently, in fact. Without words, she felt rather than saw Caspian shift slightly beside her, not toward the confrontation, not away from it, simply present in the way that large, quiet things are present, like a wall that has decided to be on your side. Matthias' jaw tightened. He looked at the Duke then, a measuring look the kind men gave each other when they were trying to determine the cost of a situation. Whatever he found in Caspian's expression did not appear to comfort him. He took his hand from Isolde's back. Celestine noticed. She told herself it did not matter. She almost believed it. They left the corridor without further ceremony, and Celestine did not watch them go. She kept her eyes forward, and her breathing measured, and her hands absolutely still at her sides. Because the one thing she would not do, the one thing she had decided in the space of a single breath, was let this night have her completely. The announcement was made 4 days later. She had expected the news of her engagement to the Duke of Norfield to move through society at a reasonable pace. She had underestimated how much people needed something to talk about, and how perfectly she and Caspian had handed them something extraordinary. By the morning of the 2nd day, it was in every drawing room. By the 3rd day, her mother had received 17 separate calls, each visitor arriving with a thin excuse and a hungry expression. By the 4th day, Vivian Ardell had cycled through shock, grief, confusion, and finally landed with tremendous relief on pride, having successfully rewritten the entire story in her own mind, so that it now featured Celestine as a woman of remarkable strategy rather than a woman who had watched her fiancé choose her sister at a ball. Celestine let her mother have it. She had neither the energy nor the cruelty to take it away. What she had instead was a growing list of things she did not know about the man she had agreed to marry, and a quiet, persistent anxiety about how long that list was becoming. She saw Caspian twice in those 4 days. Once at a brief and formal meeting with both their families present, where he was courteous and measured, and said exactly as much as the situation required and not one syllable more. Once by accident in the circulating library on Merton Street, where she had gone specifically because she believed it would be empty at that hour and she needed an hour of not being looked at. He had been standing in the history section with a book open in his hands, and he had glanced up when she entered, and the recognition between them had been immediate and oddly uncomfortable, the way it is when you see someone outside the context in which you have filed them. "You read history," she said, because silence felt worse. "I find it useful," he replied. "The present makes more sense when you understand how consistently people repeat themselves." She had pulled a novel from the nearest shelf without looking at the title and left 11 minutes later. She had thought about what he said for the rest of the afternoon. She was thinking about it. Still on the morning, she arrived at Alderidge House for the first time, ostensibly for tea with his grandmother, actually to begin the careful performance of being a believable, almost duchess. The house was larger than she had imagined, not in the showy, desperate way of families who had recently come into money and wanted everyone to know it, but in the settled, matter-of-fact way of a family who had been significant for so long that significance had simply become architectural. His grandmother, Dorothea Aldridge, was 81 years old, sharp as a letter opener, and completely undeceived. She looked at Celestine across the tea service with pale grey eyes that had clearly seen through better liars than anyone currently in the room, and said, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Celestine asked. "Someone softer," Dorothea said. "Caspian tends to frighten soft women without meaning to. It would have been a disaster." She lifted her cup. "You are not soft." "No," Celestine agreed. "I am not." Dorothea studied her for a long, unhurried moment. "He has not told you about Emiline." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Celestine kept her expression still. "No," she said carefully. "He has not." "No," the old woman echoed, and something moved through her eyes that was not quite sorrow and not quite warning, but lived in the neighbourhood of both. "He wouldn't." She did not say anything further on the subject. She poured more tea and asked about Celestine's reading habits and whether she rode, and what she thought of the current state of the county roads. And Celestine answered everything with the composure she had spent her whole life building, and all the while the name sat in the centre of her chest like a stone she had not been there to see dropped. Emiline. She did not ask Caspian about it that evening when he called briefly to ensure the meeting had gone adequately. She watched his face instead, looking for the shape of a name she hadn't been given, a door she hadn't been shown, a part of him that existed before whatever version of himself he had decided to offer her in that corridor. She found nothing. He was as composed as architecture. But that night, alone in her room with the house quiet around her, Celestine Ardell understood for the first time that she had agreed to a transaction with a man who was keeping something large and heavy entirely to himself. And the part of her that had spent 3 years loving someone who turned out to be a stranger felt that understanding settle into her bones like cold. She was not afraid, but she was paying attention now, in a way she had not paid attention before. In a way she perhaps should have paid attention to Matthias. Years earlier, when the signs had been smaller and the cost of seeing them would have been so much less. She would not make that mistake again. The engagement was announced in the society pages on a Thursday, and by Saturday Percival Aldridge had come to call. Celestine was in the front sitting room of her family's house when he arrived, working through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated since the news broke. Most of it congratulatory, some of it barely concealing the frantic curiosity underneath the pleasantries. She heard the knock, heard the brief exchange in the hall, and then the sitting room door opened and a man walked in who had not been invited and had clearly never in his life allowed that detail to slow him down. He was perhaps 60, with the broad, well-fed look of someone who had spent decades being important in rooms and expected rooms to remember it. His eyes were pale like Caspian's, but where Caspian's held stillness, Percival's held the particular restlessness of a man who was always calculating how much he stood to gain from the next 60 seconds. He looked at Celestine the way people look at obstacles, not with hostility, with assessment. "Miss Ardell," he said, settling into a chair she had not offered him. "I thought it was time we spoke plainly." Celestine set down the correspondence. "Mr. Aldridge, my mother is in the house. I am not certain this visit is appropriate without her present." "Your mother," he said pleasantly, "is precisely why I came when I did. I find mothers complicate conversations that are better kept simple." She looked at him and understood immediately that this man had spent 60 years being underestimated by people who mistook pleasantness for harmlessness. She would not make that error. "Then speak plainly," she said. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes, but it was a good smile, practiced and warm, adjacent. "My nephew is a man of considerable pride and considerable damage. Whatever he has told you about this arrangement, he has told you a version of it, the version that serves him." He paused. "I am offering you the fuller picture, out of generosity, I assume," she said. "Out of practicality. The estate dispute is not as simple as Caspian has presented it. There are documents, older ones, that raise legitimate questions about the terms of inheritance. Questions that a engagement to a woman of unremarkable fortune will not resolve regardless of what either of you believes. The word unremarkable landed without visible effect on her face. Inside it landed differently. She had grown up in a family that used that word in relation to her, without ever quite saying it aloud, and hearing it from a stranger felt less like an insult and more like confirmation of something she was very tired of confirming. "You came here to tell me the engagement won't work," she said. "I came here to tell you that you are being used as a playing piece by a man who is excellent at appearing to offer more than he intends to give." He leaned forward slightly. "I am giving you the opportunity to withdraw gracefully, before you are discarded less gracefully later." The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, a carriage moved past on the street, and somewhere deeper in the house she could hear her mother's voice, distant and cheerful, unaware. Celestine thought about Emiline. She thought about the library, and Caspian's voice, saying the present makes more sense when you understand how consistently people repeat themselves. She thought about the way Dorothea Aldridge had looked when she said the name. That particular expression that lived between sorrow and warning. She thought about 3 years of Matthias, and how the signs had been there, small and easy to excuse, and how she had excused every single one of them, because she had wanted the story she had built in her head to be the true one. She was not going to do that again. But she was also not going to let this man, with his practiced smile and his comfortable cruelty, make her decisions for her. "I appreciate your candor," she said, and her voice was so even it surprised her. "I will give you mine in return. Whatever you believe about this arrangement, whatever documents you believe support your claim, the decision of whether to proceed is mine, not yours, and I do not make decisions about my own life based on the advice of men who arrive uninvited and sit in chairs they were not offered." Percival Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. The smile thinned. "You are more formidable than I expected," he said. "Yes," she replied. "I am finding that out myself." He left without ceremony, and the moment the front door closed behind him, Celestine stood up from her chair and walked to the window and pressed her fingers against the glass because she needed to feel something solid while the shaking moved through her and out the other side. She had held. She had not bent, but his words had left marks, not because she believed him entirely, but because she believed him partially, and that partial belief was now lodged in her chest beside Emiline's name, and together the two of them were becoming a question she could no longer defer. She sent word to Caspian that evening, not through the formal channels they had established, not through her mother or his secretary. Directly. 3 words. "We need to speak." He arrived within the hour, which told her something she filed away carefully. A man who took an hour to respond to 3 words was a man who had been waiting for them. He stepped into the sitting room and read her face before she said a word, and something in his expression changed. The architecture shifted, just slightly, just enough. "Percival came," he said. It was not a question. He did. She looked at him steadily. "Now you are going to tell me about Emiline, all of it. And you are not going to give me the version that serves you." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever stood inside. And then Caspian Aldridge, Duke of Norfield, a man who had survived war and grief and legal siege without once losing his composure, closed his eyes briefly. And when he opened them again, he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like someone who was genuinely afraid of what came next. He sat down. That was the first thing. Caspian Aldridge, who she had never once seen do anything that suggested uncertainty, sat down in the chair across from her as though his legs had made the decision before the rest of him caught up, and he was quiet for long enough that the fire in the grate had time to shift and settle before he spoke. "Emiline Voss," he said. "She was the daughter of a merchant family in the north. We met during my second year back from the war. She was unlike anyone I had encountered in any of the rooms I was expected to inhabit. And I made the mistake, or perhaps it was not a mistake, of falling in love with her. Celestine did not move. She watched his face and let him continue. My uncle opposed it from the beginning. She was not titled, her family had no standing, and Percival has always understood the Norfield estate primarily as a thing to be protected from poor decisions, the category in which he placed Emiline without deliberation. He paused. He found ways to make things difficult. Socially, legally, financially. He is skilled at applying pressure in places that do not leave visible marks. What happened to her? Celestine said. Not a question, a direction. She died. The words came out flat and careful, the way words come out when a person has had to say them enough times that they have learned to remove the feeling from the saying of them in order to survive it. In the winter, 3 years ago, she had been ill for some time. I did not know the extent of it because she did not want me to know, and I had been occupied with the legal siege Percival had initiated, and I was not paying the attention I should have been paying. He looked at his hands. I have not forgiven myself for that. I do not expect to. The room was very still. Celestine felt the weight of what he had given her, not just the information but the cost of giving it. The way it had clearly required something from him to say it plainly instead of burying it in the elegant deflection she had watched him deploy in every other situation. Your uncle used her, she said. He used the vulnerability she represented. Yes, and now he is using me the same way, trying to make me a liability rather than an asset. She thought of Percival's careful smile, the word unremarkable delivered like something minor. He came here today to frighten me into withdrawing. Caspian looked up. I know. I should have warned you that he would. I underestimated how quickly he would move. Something crossed his face that she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to expressing regret. That was careless of me. I am sorry. It was such a simple apology that it nearly undid her, because she had spent 3 years with a man who never apologized for anything, and had somehow normalized that as what men were, and here was this one, saying sorry in a sitting room at 9 in the evening, because he had failed to protect her from an ambush. And meaning it. She absorbed that quietly and set it aside for later. What do the documents say? She asked. The ones Percival mentioned. They are an older version of the inheritance clause that Percival's legal team argues supersedes the current deed. It requires not merely marriage but a marriage of specific social standing, a clause that was standard in my grandfather's era and that my father's solicitors believed had been replaced. It had not been fully replaced. There is a gap in the documentation. He met her eyes. Your family name is respectable, Celestine, but it is not titled. Percival's argument is that our engagement does not satisfy the original clause. The use of her given name registered somewhere in her chest. He had not used it before. Then we make it satisfy, she said. It is not that simple. It rarely is. What do we need? He studied her for a moment. A public and unambiguous demonstration that this marriage is legitimate in the eyes of the people whose opinions carry legal and social weight. Not just an announcement, presence, visibility. The kind of endorsement that Percival cannot argue around. His grandmother, Celestine said, thinking of Dorothea's pale grey eyes, and the way she had looked at Celestine across the tea service with something that had not been warmth exactly, but had been close to its more serious cousin. She is respected, universally. She is 81 and does not involve herself in family disputes as a rule. She told me about Emiline, Celestine said. Caspian went still. She told you. She said you wouldn't. She was correct. Celestine held his gaze. She told me because she wanted me to know what I was stepping into. That is not the action of a woman who intends to remain uninvolved. That is the action of a woman who has already chosen a side and is waiting to be asked. The silence stretched between them differently than it had before. Something had changed in the room's atmosphere. Something had been set down or perhaps picked up, she was not certain which. "You would ask her," he said slowly. "I would ask her," Celestine confirmed, "and I believe she would say yes. But that is not the only thing." She stood because she needed to be standing for what came next, needed the solidness of her own feet under her. "If we are doing this, then we are doing it as something real enough to withstand scrutiny. Not because the courts require it. Because Percival is going to continue applying pressure in places that do not leave marks, and the only defense against that is a foundation he cannot find a gap in." Caspian rose as well. They were standing closer than they had ever stood, close enough that she could see the precise moment her words reached somewhere behind his composure. "You are suggesting we change the terms," he said. "I am suggesting the terms were always going to be insufficient." She did not look away from him. "A transaction has gaps. People do not fight for transactions, they endure them. And endurance is not going to be enough against a man like your uncle." He was very quiet. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone moving something fragile, he said, "I did not bring you into this to ask you to fight for it." "I know," she said. "I am choosing to." Something broke open in his expression then, not dramatically, not the way things broke open in novels, but quietly, the way rooms feel different when a window is finally opened after a long winter, a shift in pressure, an intake of new air. Percival made his next move the following week, filing a formal challenge with the county court and releasing a carefully worded statement to 3 separate society publications suggesting the engagement was one of convenience rather than legitimacy. It was elegant and vicious and designed to make them look desperate. Dorothea Aldridge appeared at a public assembly 4 days later on Celestine's arm. She had not attended a public assembly in 9 years. Every person in that room knew it. She walked in slowly and with tremendous dignity, and she introduced Celestine to 6 people whose names carried the kind of weight that made solicitors reconsider their positions, and she did it all without once acknowledging that anything unusual was occurring, which was precisely what made it extraordinary. Percival's formal challenge was quietly withdrawn 2 weeks later. He did not disappear. Men like Percival Aldridge did not disappear. He receded to the middle distance, watchful and recalculating, and Celestine understood that he would remain there indefinitely, a permanent feature of the landscape she had chosen to inhabit. She filed that understanding alongside everything else she had learned, and she did not pretend it was resolved. It was managed. That was different and more honest. On the evening the withdrawal was confirmed, Caspian found her in the library at Aldridge House, standing at the window in the last of the daylight. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment, and she let the silence be what it was, which was no longer uncomfortable. "You did not have to do any of this," he said finally. "Neither did you," she replied, "when you crossed that ballroom." He turned to look at her profile. "That is different, is it?" She turned to meet his eyes. "You saw someone about to break, and you decided to stand beside them." "I saw the same thing." The direction was different. The choice was the same. He looked at her for a long time. And Celestine Ardell, who had spent years making herself smaller, who had loved a man who chose someone else, who had said yes in a corridor to a stranger and meant it more than she had meant, almost anything, felt no inclination to look away. "What happens now?" he said quietly. And for the first time in longer than she could account for, she smiled, and it was not the composed, careful smile she had learned to perform. It was real and a little uncertain and completely hers. "Now," she said, "we find out." 3 months into a marriage that had begun as a transaction, Celestine made a discovery that rearranged everything she thought she understood about the man she had married. It started with a door, not metaphorically, an actual door, at the end of the east wing of Aldridge House, that she had assumed was a storage room, and had never tried because there had always been something more pressing to address. But on a quiet Tuesday morning when Caspian was away meeting with his solicitors, and the house had settled into the particular stillness that large houses find when their primary occupant is absent, she tried the handle. It opened into a room full of paintings. Not hung paintings, not a gallery arranged for visitors. Can vases stacked against walls, some finished, some not, some barely begun, all of them landscapes of the same northern terrain in different lights and seasons. And in the corner, a small table with brushes and pigment, and the specific comfortable disorder of a space that belonged entirely to one person's private self. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She had known Caspian for 4 months. She had watched him be precise and composed and strategically generous, and occasionally, in unguarded moments, something warmer that he did not seem to entirely trust in himself. She had learned the shape of his silences and the specific quality of his attention when something genuinely interested him. She had learned that he read history because it steadied him, and that he was kind to his staff in the particular way of someone who had thought about it rather than someone who simply performed it. She had not known this. She was still standing there when she heard his footstep in the corridor behind her, earlier than expected, and she turned to find him stopped in the hallway, with his coat still on, looking at her in the open doorway with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Unguarded in a way that went all the way down. "The meeting ended early," he said. Not an explanation, almost an apology. "These are extraordinary," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "They are private." "I know. I am sorry for the intrusion." She meant it. "I did not know you painted. I do not discuss it." He came to stand beside her in the doorway, looking into the room as though assessing the damage of being seen. Emiline was the only person who knew. "After she died, I continued, because stopping felt like losing her twice." The sentence was so honest it nearly hurt to hear. Celestine did not reach for something comforting to say, because she had learned in 4 months that he did not want comfort arranged decoratively around difficult truths. He wanted the truth met directly. "You have been carrying this alone for 3 years, she said. "It felt like mine to carry." "It is still yours," she said. "I am not asking you to put it down. I am only saying that being known is not the same as being diminished." She paused. "Someone told me something like that once, in a corridor, in different words." He looked at her then, and the look was different from every look that had come before it. Different from the calculating attention of the ballroom and the careful composure of the courtroom days and even the window evening when something had opened between them. This was direct and undefended, and it asked a question he had not put into words. She answered it anyway. "I am not Emiline," she said quietly. "I am not trying to be. I am not here to replace what you lost. I am here as whatever I actually am to you, which I think neither of us has finished deciding yet." The morning light came through the corridor window and lay across the floor between them. And Caspian Aldridge, Duke of Norfield, reached out and took a hand with a care that suggested he was holding something he did not intend to be careless with again. They stood like that for a while, at the threshold of a room full of private grief and private beauty, and Celestine thought about the girl she had been in that ballroom, holding warm champagne and watching her future choose someone else, and she understood that the girl had not been foolish. She had simply not yet arrived at the place where the right things were waiting. She had arrived now. There was still Percival, watchful in the middle distance. There were still legal matters and social negotiations, and the particular exhaustion of being a public pair, when so much of what mattered was private. There was still the slow and non-linear work of 2 people learning to trust each other in the spaces where trust actually lived. Not in grand gestures, but in small and daily choices. There was still, she suspected, a great deal of story left. But standing here, in the quiet of a Tuesday morning, with her hand in his and a room full of paintings at her back, Celestine felt something she recognized from childhood and had nearly forgotten was real. She felt like herself. Completely, without apology, without arrangement. That was not nothing. In fact, standing there, she was fairly certain it was everything. And somewhere in the house, a door she had not noticed before stood slightly open, which in Alderidge House, she was learning, almost always meant something worth walking toward. She intended to find out what, so did he, and if you have made it this far, beloved, then you already know this story has its hooks in you, and I am so grateful it does. Did you see that coming, Caspian and his paintings? The grief he had been carrying alone all this time. And what do you think Percival does next, now that the courts have failed him? Because that man does not strike me as someone who accepts defeat quietly. If you want to find out, you know what to do. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell and come back for what comes next, because Celestine and Caspian are only just beginning. And I promise you, the story gets richer from here. Thank you for being here. Truly, it means everything.